Welcome to the Library of Humanity. Today we're talking about living abroad / studying abroad and learning a second language. What is the truth of that experience? So first and foremost, I lived in Ecuador for a year and a half and quote unquote learned Spanish. So that's where I'm coming from, is from experience and not theory. So my experience is that it is way different than what you think. So living abroad in another country, specifically in a developing country, the developing countries mean the third world countries, countries that are not Europe and North America. Those countries are those that you want to teach English in, right? But these countries want to use English to become a developed country. Developed would be Europe and North America, right? So you have to think about this entire concept of you want to bring English into a third world country. Now, can you see the similarities between the Spanish wanting to bring Catholicism to the Americas, in the 1500s? Do you see any correlation there where you're bringing knowledge that you perceive as superior to another area of the world that is theoretically underdeveloped, that you could call it, right? But we want to completely ignore that term underdeveloped, and that's the reason why we call them developing, is that these countries that we want to teach English in are heading towards developed. And that entire idea of a process is another discussion, like where are we going? Is there an end point of this development process? Okay, so this is similar because I'm also a geography teacher, student teacher specifically. So that's why I'm very interested in the whole idea of third world countries wanting to develop to become first world countries, and that whole ethical process. And that's what I call N-E-O, colonization. So colonization would be when Europe colonized the Americas in the 1500s, and then when Europe imperialized Africa and Asia in like the 1800s. Okay, I'm saying that colonization is not done. Colonization is like your desire to teach English in the third world. Okay, and I'm telling you this from my experience because that comes from my privilege, my white privilege, and also I'm a man, so it's male privilege, my white male privilege to teach English and make money in a third world country. Okay, this is an interesting topic. I'm not saying it's a problem, I'm just saying it's privilege. I'm not saying privilege is inherently good or inherently bad. I'm saying that your ability and desire to teach English in a third world / developing country is a sign of your privilege, first and foremost. So when you are going to this country to learn Spanish or Portuguese, you're going there from a position of privilege. That's the first thing that you need to know. Second thing that you need to know is once you are living in that third world country, that these people, there's going to be a mix. Like, people are people. So people are going to ignore you, and some people are going to really like you. But that's going to be kind of a minority of people who are going to see you as kind of this exotic white person. Like, oh, I want to learn a lot from this white person about American culture or European culture. But that's going to be a minority of people. Most people aren't going to really care too much about you. They're just going to keep going about their day-to-day business and not worry too much about other parts of the world. Because here in America, for example, most Americans just care about America, right? So if you're in Ecuador, where I was, most Ecuadorians, they just care about Ecuador, okay? And that's part of being a human, is that you mostly just care about your particular area that you're living in, okay? The third important thing is that you're going to want to learn the language when you're there, specifically a quote-unquote useful language that a lot of the people around the world speak, such as Spanish, Portuguese, or French. And that is very hard, okay? So one thing I thought about before I went to Ecuador was, okay, I'm going to live abroad for a year, and I'm going to automatically learn Spanish. No. It requires so much effort to become fluent in a language in 1 year, even through immersion, even through living abroad for a year, you're not going to learn the language that well, okay? The reason why I became fluent in Spanish at that time, I'm no longer fluent in Spanish. I was at the time. So the idea is you become fluent pretty quickly by working hard, but once you come back to your home for a year, 2 years, 3 years. So I've been back in Minnesota for 3 years since living in Ecuador for a year and a half. So I became very fluent in that year and a half through working hard and using my resources while I was there. I wasn't partying too much. I wasn't speaking English too much. I was there to learn Spanish and learn the culture of Ecuador. So I dedicated myself to that. Now, since I've come back to Minnesota, I have been speaking only English and focusing more on like the world and how America fits in the world, right? So I'm not focused exclusively on Latin America like I was living in Ecuador. So that's why I'm basically out of the Latino culture, specifically speaking Spanish. I'm basically out of that. So like, yes, if you start speaking Spanish fluently, I'll probably understand you, but I'm no longer fluent in Spanish because those 3 years after learning the language, you basically forget how to speak it fluently unless, you travel for 2 weeks in Colombia again or Mexico. Then you might pick it up again. But learning another language is way harder than you think. It requires so much more effort than you think. However, the benefits of learning that language, or like the way that learning a second language makes you feel, is way better than you expect. Like, it gives you so much self-esteem being able to have a conversation with somebody who doesn't speak English. That conversation, it's like another whole part of your personality. So it's like, I'm Kyle, right? So there's this Kyle character that speaks English. But when I was living in Ecuador, I was known as Eric. So that's my middle name, so that's why I was known as Eric. It's also easier to pronounce in Spanish. That was like an alter ego. So like I was Kyle in English, but then I was Eric in Espanol. I was Eric in Spanish, right? So those are two aspects of your personality that you kind of develop when you become bilingual or when you speak 2 languages. So that's another thing that I didn't really notice before I went to Ecuador, was that, I'm going to have 2 personalities, this English personality and this Spanish personality, okay? And then number 4, when you come back, it's called reverse culture shock. So when you come back to your home country, people, they don't really care that you lived abroad, okay? So again, most people in America, they care about America. Most people in Germany, they care about Germany. Or most people in Europe, they care about Europe. So when you go and live in another country, first of all, the people back in America, they know nothing about the country that you lived in. They know nothing about Ecuador. They know nothing about Nigeria, okay? People care about their own country. And that's the same in Nigeria, that's the same in Ecuador, that's the same all around the world. Most people just care about their own country. So don't be surprised when you live abroad for a year or 2 years, you become fluent in that language, and you come back to America or Europe, and nobody cares. Like, not even on your resume. Okay, your resume is going to say, I lived abroad for a year and a half, and I became fluent in Spanish during that time. Basically, employers, that's the word I was looking for, employers are going to not care or even ignore the fact that you did that. That's actually the fact that you lived abroad for a year and a half teaching English, that's going to look like a gap in your resume. So they're looking for, like, where did you graduate college? Did you get a master's degree? And do you have working experience in the first world? Do you have working experience in the developed world, like in Germany or the UK or Canada, right? These are countries that's where the working experience is important according to employers, right? But employers, so on the resume, your ability to speak a second language seems important, or it doesn't seem important on the resume. But when a client comes in from Brazil or Mexico that doesn't speak English, now all of a sudden you're useful and your boss is like, whoa, I didn't know that you spoke Spanish that well, or that I didn't know you spoke Portuguese that well. So they get really, really, really like astonished that you can actually speak Spanish fluently. Because for them, it's just like a thing that you check on your resume. It's just like it's materialism. Like, I speak Spanish. It's just another thing I can add to my ego, right? Or another thing that I can add to my resume, or another thing that I can put on my dating apps. Like, oh, I speak Spanish. But no, the reason why you speak Spanish is because it's a connection to humanity, right? Spanish is a community. It's an entire culture that you don't have any access to unless you speak Spanish. I cannot emphasize that enough, is that because you don't speak Spanish, you literally don't know anything about the Latino culture. Okay, maybe you know some, but the language is the main aspect of any culture. So in America, the main aspect of America is your ability to speak English the way I do, or if you're in the South, to have a little bit of a twang, a little bit of a twang as part of the culture, okay? But anywhere else in the world, you have to be able to speak that language in order to be considered a part of that culture, okay? So when you are in another country and you gain the ability to speak that language well, all of a sudden you become part of that culture, you become part of that community, and it feels so good. But that's going to be number 5. Number 5 is, even though it feels good initially that you seem to be part of a second culture, that like, oh, all of a sudden I'm bilingual and bicultural. Okay, this is a big misnomer, big mistake. If you are not born in Ecuador, and if Spanish is not your native language, you will never, ever, ever be Ecuadorian. Okay, if you are born outside of America and English is not your first language, most Americans are not going to consider you American. Okay, I disagree with that, and I disagree with the fact that I can't be Ecuadorian because I was born in Minnesota, but that's how most people, maybe 70% of people, they subconsciously see that. They subconsciously see a brown person unable to speak English perfectly, and maybe have a Middle Eastern accent. They don't view them as American, even though they have they're American citizens with a passport and have the ability to travel anywhere in the world with the privileges of an American. But the fact that they weren't born here and have an accent, they're never going to be subconsciously considered an American. And that's the case of you as a white person or Black American that speaks English. You can't go to India and become an Indian, even if you live abroad for 3, 5, 8, 10 years. Even if you marry an Ecuadorian in Ecuador and you become fluent in Spanish and become a citizen of Ecuador, you're still not going to be considered an Ecuadorian from the standards of most Ecuadorians, especially the conservative type people. Okay, there are conservatives in every part of the world. Okay, one of the misnomers or mistakes that very liberal people make is that they assume that everyone else in the world is also liberal. They think that the only conservatives in the world are in America. They think the only conservatives in the world are Christian. They think the only conservatives in the world are white. That's a huge mistake. Actually, most of the world, I repeat, most of the world is conservative. 70% of the world is conservative and xenophobic and believe that their culture is the best. About 70%, a big majority of people all across the world. You go to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, most people are conservative. You go to South Africa, most people are conservative. And you go to Thailand, most people are conservative. Japan, most people are conservative. Of course, America, most people are conservative. Even in Sweden, yes, I'm saying, even in Sweden, most people are conservative, okay? And that's going to be an argument from a different video. So I'm going to discuss that in the future. And if you have any questions about tips on living abroad, tips on learning a second language, specifically Spanish, you can comment below. If you like the video, if you find this helpful for you, you can click the like button. Luckily, I was able to get a video out in midweek here. You can expect a video this weekend. However, I'm very, very busy. I'm a student teacher. I'm lesson planning. I'm correcting exams. I'm very, very busy. So stay tuned, and we're going to go back to the topics of truth, enlightenment, and wisdom. But this is a more practical video. Stay tuned. Peace.